Before we begin, if you enjoy stories that lull you into a strange world between history and imagination, consider subscribing to Nightfall Notions for more tales that are just unsettling enough to make you forget your own restless thoughts. Now, settle in for the first chapter of What Really Happened at the Sleepover in the Tower of London, a story that promises historical revelry, unsettling hospitality, and perhaps a ghost or two who forgot to RSVP. Chapter 1. The Invitation to the Tower. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, which was already suspicious. Good news never comes on a Tuesday. It was thick, cream-colored, and sealed with a blob of wax the color of dried blood. The stamp bore no postmark, as if it had been delivered by hand, or by something that didn't care for the bureaucratic formalities of the Royal Mail. Inside, the invitation was written in looping, old-fashioned script, the kind that made you squint and tilt the paper toward the light, as if the words might rearrange themselves if you looked away for too long. You are cordially invited to an evening of historical revelry and nocturnal merriment within the venerable walls of Her Majesty's Tower of London. A sleepover of singular peculiarity awaits. Arrive at dusk. Do not bring a toothbrush. To inform the ravens of your dietary restrictions. The gates will open once. There's no signature. Now, under normal circumstances, receiving an anonymous invitation to spend the night in a building best known for housing the occasional beheaded queen might give a person pause. But the recipients of these letters were not what one might call normal circumstances. There was Arthur Pembleton, a historian who specialized in 16th century plumbing and had once tried to patent a Tudor-era toilet seat. There was Beatrice B. Holloway, a tour guide at the tower who had on 3 separate occasions been politely asked to stop correcting the official guides in front of paying customers. And then there was Reginald Fitch, a man who had won his invitation in a pub bet after insisting that the crown jewels were, in fact, just very convincing replicas. They arrived separately, each convinced they were the only ones invited, each secretly hoping there would be finger sandwiches. The tower loomed before them, its stones soaked in centuries of damp and dread. The ravens, those feathered bureaucrats of doom, watched from the battlements with the weary patience of creatures who had seen this all before. A single lantern flickered by the gate, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the visitors like fingers. "Right," said Arthur, adjusting his spectacles. "I suppose we knock?" "No need," Bee replied, pointing to the gate, which was now, inexplicably, slightly ajar. Reginald, who had fortified himself with several pints before arriving, squinted at the darkness beyond. "This is either going to be brilliant or the last thing we ever do. Statistically, it's probably both." They stepped inside. The courtyard was empty, save for a long table set with silver candlesticks, a platter of suspiciously fresh grapes, and a single note that read, "Make yourselves at home. The walls are listening." Up above, a window creaked open, then shut. The ravens muttered among themselves. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck the hour, though no one could agree on what hour it actually was. And so, the sleepover began. The air smelled of old stone, and something faintly metallic, like a penny left in the rain. Arthur immediately began inspecting the table for historical inaccuracies. Bee started whispering to the ravens as if they were old friends, and Reginald helped himself to the grapes, pausing only to remark, "These are definitely not in season." Then, from the depths of the tower, a sound echoed, a low, rhythmic scraping, like a chair being dragged across a floor, or perhaps a blade being sharpened. "Ah," said Bee, smiling. "Right on schedule." The invitation had promised historical revelry. It had not, however, specified whether that revelry would involve the living or the dead. But as the first ghostly figure shimmered into view at the far end of the table, holding a goblet and looking profoundly annoyed, It became clear that the guest list was going to be more interesting than anticipated. The figure raised its glass. "You're late," it said, "and you've eaten my grapes." Reginald swallowed hard. "So sorry. Were those yours?" The ghost sighed. 700 years, and they still don't teach basic manners. And with that, the sleepover truly began. Chapter 2. The Raven's Warning. The ghost's grapes were the least of their problems. As the spectral figure, who had introduced himself as Sir Roland de Beaumont, late of this parish, permanently of this tower, settled into what he referred to as his usual chair, the ravens outside began behaving in a manner that could only be described as professionally ominous. Marilyn, the largest and most self-important of the tower's resident ravens, had taken up a position directly above Arthur's head and was dropping twigs onto him with unsettling precision. "Do they always do this?" Arthur asked, brushing splinters from his hair. B, who had once written an unauthorized pamphlet on tower raven psychology, frowned. "No, they're usually more subtle. This is practically a protest." Reginald, who had been eyeing Sir Roland's goblet with the vague hope that it might contain something drinkable, glanced toward the window. "Maybe they don't like ghosts." Sir Roland sniffed. "The feeling is mutual. Those birds are dreadful gossips." At that moment, a yeoman warder, better known as a beefeater, appeared in the doorway, his expression hovering somewhere between weary resignation and mild alarm. "Evening all. Lovely night for a haunting." He glanced at the ravens, who had now begun pacing along the windowsill like feathery prison guards. "Ah, they've started then." "Started what?" Arthur asked. The beefeater sighed. "The sulking. The silent treatment. The avian equivalent of folding their arms and refusing to make eye contact." He leaned in conspiratorially. "There's an old bit of folklore around here. If the ravens stop cawing, stop making noise entirely, it means something's coming. Something bad." Reginald snorted. "Sounds like something you tell tourists to make them buy more postcards." The beefeater shrugged. "Maybe. But in 600 years, I have never seen them this quiet unless they were up to something." As if on cue, the ravens, all 7 of them, turned their heads in unison to stare at the assembled guests. Then, one by one, they hopped down from the windowsill and waddled out of the room with the solemnity of jurors exiting a courtroom. B blinked. "Well, that's new." Sir Roland swirled the contents of his goblet, which upon closer inspection appeared to be nothing but dust and regret. "They know. They always know." "Know what?" Arthur asked, adjusting his spectacles in a futile attempt to appear less nervous. The ghost gave him a look that suggested pity was an emotion best left to the living. "The last time they did this was the night before Anne Boleyn lost her head. Just saying." A beat of silence followed. Somewhere in the depths of the tower, a door creaked open, then slammed shut with the finality of a tomb ceiling. Reginald cleared his throat. "So, who's up for a game of charades?" The beefeater, who had seen enough of the tower's peculiarities to last several lifetimes, tipped his hat and made a swift exit, muttering something about overtime pay and haunted workplace policies. Left alone with a ghost, a table of suspiciously fresh fruit, and the distinct sense that they were being judged by birds, the guests did what any reasonable people would do. They pretended nothing was wrong. B examined the grapes with renewed interest. "Do you think these are cursed?" Sir Roland sighed. "Not everything is cursed. Sometimes a grape is just a grape." "Have you ever eaten a grape here before?" Arthur asked. The ghost hesitated. "Well, no, though." Another silence. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the ancient window panes. The absence of the raven's usual chatter was unnerving. Like the quiet before a storm, no one had forecast. Reginald, ever the pragmatist, reached for another grape. "If we're all going to die horribly, I'd at least like to die well hydrated." It was then that they heard it. the sound that made even Sir Roland sit up straighter in his chair. A single distant call. Not from outside. From inside the tower. From somewhere deeper, darker, and decidedly not on the official tour map. Merlin the Raven reappeared in the doorway, head tilted, black eyes gleaming. He opened his beak, and what came out was not a call, but something closer to a croak, a whisper, a word that almost sounded like Run. Arthur ventured. The Raven blinked, then turned and strutted away, leaving behind a single black feather as his only reply. Sir Roland drained his goblet of imaginary wine. Oh dear. And with that, the second rule of the tower's sleepover became abundantly clear. The Ravens were not just witnesses to history. They were the jury, and they had just reached a verdict. Chapter 3. The Ghostly Welcome. The Raven's ominous departure left an unspoken tension in the air, thick enough to slice with a ceremonial executioner's axe. Arthur B. and Reginald exchanged glances, a silent agreement that none of them wanted to be the first to voice the obvious question. What exactly had they been invited to? Sir Roland, ever the gracious if transparent host, cleared his throat, an impressive feat for someone without lungs, and gestured toward the darkened archway leading deeper into the tower. Shall we proceed? The others are waiting. Others? B asked, her voice a notch higher than usual. The ghost gave a thin, humorless smile. Did you think you were the only guests? How quaint. Before anyone could demand clarification, a new voice echoed from the shadows, smooth, deep, and unmistakably amused. Ah, excellent. You've all arrived. Mostly intact, I see. A figure emerged from the gloom, though emerged might have been too generous a term. He seemed to materialize in stages, as if the darkness itself had reluctantly spat him out. Tall, draped in a long coat that flickered between velvet and smoke, his features were sharp enough to cut parchment, and his eyes, well, it was hard to say what color they were. They seemed to change depending on which unfortunate soul he was looking at. Our host, I presume? Arthur said, attempting a bow and nearly toppling into a suit of armor. The figure inclined his head. One of many names, but yes, you may call me Drusus, tonight's facilitator. Reginald squinted. Is that a first name or a last name? It's a convenience, Drusus replied dryly. No, if you'll follow me, I'd love to give you the proper tour. The tower has so many stories, and most of them end in tragedy. Charming, really. Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode down the corridor, his coat whispering against the stone like a restless spirit. The guests, with varying degrees of reluctance, trailed after him. The tower at night was an entirely different beast. The usual daytime hum of tourists and guides was gone, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the walls were holding their breath. The flickering torchlight, who still used torches, cast long skeletal shadows that seemed to twitch when no one was looking. Drusus led them past Traitors' Gate, where the water of the Thames once lapped against the steps like a hungry thing. Lovely spot, he remarked. So many dignitaries arrived here, few left the same way, or at all. B, ever the historian, couldn't resist. You talk about these people like you knew them. Drusus paused, tilting his head. Did I not? Before she could press further, he gestured to a narrow staircase. Up we go. Mind the steps, they're older than your grandparents, and far less forgiving. The climb was steep, the air growing colder with each step. By the time they reached the top, even Reginald, who had once bragged about his ability to sleep through a hurricane, was breathing heavily. They emerged into a long gallery lined with portraits of long-dead nobility, their eyes seeming to track the group as they passed. The tower's guestbook, Drusus said cheerfully. Every portrait is someone who stayed here, some by choice, most not. Arthur squinted at a particularly dour-faced man in a ruff. That's Sir Walter Raleigh, isn't it? Drusus nodded. Lovely fellow, terrible at chess. Reginald blinked. You played chess with Sir Walter Raleigh? Lost 3 shillings to him, still bitter. Drusus waved a hand dismissively. This way. The next room was small, circular, and dominated by an enormous wooden chair that looked like it had been carved from a single, very unhappy tree. The coronation chair? B gasped. A replica, Drusus corrected. The real one's at Westminster. This one's for other purposes. Sir Rowland, who had been drifting along silently, let out a low chuckle. Ah, the interviews. Drusus smirked. Precisely. Arthur, now thoroughly uneasy, adjusted his spectacles. What kind of interviews? Instead of answering, Drusus ran a finger along the chair's armrest, dislodging centuries of dust. Did you know that every prisoner who passed through these walls left something behind? A whisper, a sigh, a last word that never quite faded. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. Some of them are still here, listening. A draught slithered through the room, snuffing out 2 of the torches. Reginald swallowed. Right. So, drink soon? Drusus straightened, his smirk widening. Oh, we're just getting started. He led them onward, deeper into the tower's labyrinth, his voice weaving tales of betrayal, lost loves, and at least one incident involving a duke, a duck, and a very unfortunate misunderstanding about poultry-based treason. The stories were vivid, detailed. Too detailed, as if Drusus had been there himself. B, unable to resist, finally asked the question hanging over them all. You speak about these events like you witnessed them. Drusus paused at the entrance to another corridor, his face half in shadow. Perhaps I did. But that's impossible, Arthur protested. Unless you're a ghost. Drusus finished, amused. Oh, no. Ghosts are bound to their regrets. I'm something else entirely. Sir Rowland, floating nearby, muttered, "It's the reason the ravens left." Drusus ignored him, stepping into the next room. Ah, here we are. The chamber beyond was unlike any other they'd seen. A grand hall, lined with long tables laden with food and drink. Candles flickered in wrought iron chandeliers, casting dancing light over the faces of the assembled guests. And what guests they were! Men in doublets and hose, women in elaborate gowns, soldiers in rusted armor, all translucent, all watching the newcomers with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disdain. A woman in a stained Tudor gown raised a spectral goblet. Fresh meat! Drusus spread his arms. Welcome, he said, to the real sleepover. Reginald stared. Are you dead? Not yet, Drusus replied. But don't worry, the night is young. Chapter 4. The Banquet of Forgotten Dishes. The grand hall smelled of spices long fallen out of favor, and meats that had not been seen on a respectable table for centuries. The banquet before them was a historian's dream, or nightmare, depending on one's tolerance for dishes that wobbled ominously or appeared to contain ingredients best left unidentified. Reginald eyed a glistening mound of something that might have been eel, or possibly a very ambitious jelly. Is this sanitary? Drusus, now seated at the head of the table with the air of a man who had presided over many questionable meals, raised an eyebrow. Define sanitary in contiennort. Arthur, ever the scholar, leaned in with academic curiosity. This is extraordinary. I've only read about these dishes in manuscripts. Look, there's a blank manger, a medieval chicken pudding. B poked at a golden-crusted pie with a fork. Do we want to know what's inside? A ghost in a ruffled collar, who had introduced himself as Lord Pembleton, no relation to Arthur, thankfully, leered across the table. Depends. Do you enjoy surprises? The feast was a parade of culinary horrors and delights. There was peacock, roasted and redressed in its own feathers, its beady eyes seeming to follow the diners. A platter of lampreys swam in a dark sauce that smelled faintly of iron. Yellowed eels quivered under candlelight like creatures still dreaming of escape. Reginald, after a fortifying gulp of something called hippocras, a spiced wine strong enough to strip varnish, bravely took a bite of something unidentifiable. His expression cycled through confusion, horror, and reluctant acceptance. Tastes like regret and nutmeg. "Ah, you found the yumble pie," Drusus said approvingly. "Made from the humbles, that is, the heart, liver, and other delights of a deer, a favorite of Henry VIII, allegedly." Arthur, undeterred, scribbled notes on a napkin. "Fascinating. The texture is truly—" He paused, chewing thoughtfully. Me, meanwhile, had discovered a bowl of something labeled Osama Gunding, a salad that appeared to contain every ingredient ever grown, pickled, or hunted, all tossed together with reckless abandon. "I think there's a raisin in here that's older than I am." The ghostly guests ate with gusto, though it was unclear whether they actually consumed the food or simply passed it through their spectral forms for nostalgia's sake. Sir Roland sipped at his wine, the liquid disappearing into his ghostly throat like smoke. "The living always fuss about flavor. We care more about memory." A particularly corpulent spectre in a stained doublet, who had introduced himself as Sir Godfrey Three Dinners Montague, leaned in. "Tastes exactly like it did the night before my execution. Marvelous." Reginald set down his fork. "I'm sorry, did you say execution?" Sir Godfrey waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, yes. Misunderstanding over a sheep. Dreadful business." Drusus clinked his knife against his goblet. "A toast to the living who still have the privilege of indigestion." The assembled ghosts raised their glasses with a chorus of hollow cheers. The meal took a turn when a tureen of Baker Contration was unveiled, a Frankensteinian dish of sewn-together poultry and pork, roasted to a crisp and grinning up at them with edible mouth. B blinked. "That's art." Arthur, peering closer, adjusted his spectacles. "I think it's judging us." Reginald, now thoroughly soused on hippocras, gestured with a bread roll. "Question: if we eat ghost food, do we become ghosts?" Drusus smiled. "Only one way to find out." The conversation meandered from historical recipes to the merits of treacle tart versus modern desserts, though it was derailed briefly when Lord Pembleton began arguing with Sir Godfrey over whether Elizabeth I had ever actually eaten the sugared violets she was so famous. "She loathed them," Lord Pembleton insisted. "I was there when she threw a box at Raleigh's head." Just as the meal seemed to be winding down, a new platter was brought out, a towering, wobbling mass of pale jelly studded with dark shapes that might have been fruit, or possibly something more sinister. "Ah," Drusus said, with the relish of a man about to deliver bad news. "Bland mange, the uvado kind." Arthur peered at it. "What's in it?" "Almond milk, cinnamon, and capon's brains." Reginald turned an interesting shade of green. "That's a choice." B, ever the pragmatist, took a small spoonful and chewed thoughtfully. Creamy. Also squeaky." Sir Roland sighed. "And to think, I died of dysentery when Othesy was on the menu." The ghosts erupted into laughter, a sound like wind through a crypt. As the banquet drew to a close, the candles burning low, and the wine flowing a little too freely, especially for the living, Drusus leaned back in his chair. "Tell me, mortals, what do you think of our hospitality so far?" Arthur, flushed from drink and scholarly excitement, beamed. "It's been incredibly educational." B nodded. "And deeply unsettling." Reginald, now slumped in his chair, raised a limp hand. "I think I'm hallucinating." Drusus chuckled. Oh no, that comes later. That moment, the doors at the far end of the hall creaked open, revealing a long, dark corridor. A cold draft slithered in, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and something metallic. Drusus stood, his coat swirling like ink in water. Now, who's ready for the after-dinner entertainment? The ravens, perched silently in the rafters, watched as the guests, living and dead, exchanged wary glances. No one dared ask what the entertainment meant. But the tower, as always, had its own ideas. Chapter 5. The Bloody Tower's Sleepover Setup. The corridor leading to their sleeping quarters was narrow, uneven, and lined with portraits of Tudor monarchs whose expressions suggested they had personally disapproved of the concept of comfortable sleeping arrangements. The flickering torchlight made their eyes seem to follow the group as they walked, a silent jury of long-dead royalty. At the end of the passage stood an oak door, pitted with age and secured by a wrought-iron latch that looked more ceremonial than functional. Drusus placed a pale hand against the wood and pushed it open with a creak that could have been lifted straight from a stage play about haunted houses. "Your accommodations," he announced, stepping aside with a flourish. The chamber beyond was circular, dominated by a high, vaulted ceiling and a single narrow window that offered a sliver of moonlit sky. The walls were bare stone, worn smooth by centuries of damp and despair, and the air smelled faintly of lavender, a valiant but ultimately futile attempt to mask the deeper, earthier scent of history's less pleasant moments. Most notably, 4 beds had been arranged in a semicircle around a cold hearth. They were 4-poster affairs, draped in heavy velvet hangings that might have been sumptuous in another lifetime, but now sagged with the weight of dust and mothballed secrets. Arthur was the first to step inside, his scholarly instincts overriding his self-preservation. "This is the Bloody Tower, isn't it?" Drusus smiled. "Very good. The very room where young Edward Vafee and his brother Richard were said to have met their untimely end." Reginald, who had been trailing behind in a haze of Hippocras-induced bravery, blinked. "Wait, the princes in the towery? Why, those princes." "The very same." B ran a hand along one of the bedposts. "And we're sleeping here?" Drusus clasped his hands together. "Authenticity is key to the experience, though I've taken the liberty of upgrading the mattresses. The original straw stuffing was unforgiving." Reginald eyed the nearest bed with suspicion. "Upgraded to what, exactly? Cobblestones?" Arthur, meanwhile, had already begun inspecting the walls, tapping at the stones like an over-eager archaeologist. "Fascinating. If the legends are true, there could be hidden passages, secret routes used by the murderers to slip in and out unnoticed." B shot him a look. "Do you find a secret passage tonight?" Sir Roland, who had drifted in behind them, chuckled. "Oh, they're there. But I wouldn't go poking around unless you fancy meeting the tower's viewer residents." A silence fell. Somewhere in the distance a floorboard groaned, as if the tower itself were shifting in its sleep. Reginald cleared his throat. "Right, so, who's claiming which deathbed?" The group hesitated, eyeing the 4 posters with varying degrees of unease. Each bed bore a small embroidered pillow, a touch that might have been charming if the stitching hadn't depicted what looked suspiciously like tiny skulls. P, ever practical, tossed her bag onto the bed farthest from the hearth. This one, less drafty. Arthur, still preoccupied with the walls, absent-mindedly claimed the bed nearest the window. "Perfect for morning light, if we live to see it." Reginald flopped onto the remaining bed with the grace of a man who had accepted his fate. "If I die tonight, I want it noted that I giddy complain about this." Drusus clasped his hands together. "Excellent. A few ground rules. 1. The chamber pot is antique. Please respect its history. 2. If you hear scratching in the walls, it's probably rats. 3. The ghosts are mostly harmless, though I'd avoid engaging in political debate with the ones in period dress. They're eerie sensitive about the of the roses. B raised an eyebrow. Mostly harmless? Sir Roland snorted. He's being polite. The last living guest who argued with Henry Vevey's ghost about fiscal policy woke up with his shoes nailed to the floor. Reginald sat up. Voy. Drusus waved a dismissive hand. A harmless prank. Now, sleep well. Or don't. Either way, breakfast is at dawn. Assuming you're still hungry after tonight's revelations. With that, he retreated, shutting the door behind him with a click that sounded far too final. The room seemed to exhale in his absence. The candles, which had burned unnaturally steady in Drusus's presence, now guttered weakly, casting long, leaping shadows across the walls. Reginald flopped back onto his pillow, then immediately lifted his head again. Why does this smell like mildew and regret? B was already unpacking a modern sleeping bag she'd had the foresight to bring. Because it's authentic sky. Arthur, meanwhile, had taken to examining the ceiling. Do you think the princes actually died here? The historical record is frustratingly vague. A loud thumpum from somewhere inside the wall cut him off. All three living guests froze. Reginald swallowed. That was the wind? Another thump. Closer this time. B slowly zipped up her sleeping bag. Or in oddity, the wind. Arthur, ever the optimist, brightened. Perhaps it's just the plumbing. Sir Roland, who had been hovering near the window, let out a dry laugh. Oh yes, the tower is infamous for its excellent plumbing. The scratching started shortly after, a skittering, nails-on-stone sound that seemed to circle the room just beyond the walls. Reginald pulled the velvet bed hangings around himself like a fortress. I'd like to formally retract my earlier complaint about the banquet. This is the worst part. B, now cocooned in her sleeping bag, muttered, It's not rats. Rats don't giggle. The sound had indeed taken on a distinctly unrat-like quality. A low, whispering chuckle that seemed to weave between the stones. Arthur, to his credit, attempted reason. There's likely a perfectly rational explanation. Drafts, settling stones, gosks. Another thump. This time, it came from directly beneath Arthur's bed. He yelped and scrambled backward, nearly toppling into Reginald's bed. Sir Roland sighed. And so it begins. A cold draught snaked through the room, extinguishing 2 of the candles. The remaining flame stretched unnaturally tall, casting monstrous shadows onto the ceiling. Shadows that moved independently of the flickering light. Reginald, now fully under the covers, spoke in a muffled voice. I'd like to wake up now. B sat up, gripping her flashlight like a weapon. If something comes out of that wall, I'm hitting it with this. Arthur adjusted his spectacles, though his hands weren't entirely steady. Fascinating. Do you think it's residual energy, a replay of past events, or... The scratching stopped. The room fell silent. Then, from the hearth, a space that had been cold and empty moments before, came the sound of a child's whisper. Who's there? The voice was faint, trembling, and unmistakably young. Sir Roland closed his eyes. Ah, que me. Reginald went very still. Please tell me that's not. B cut in, her voice tight. The princes. The temperature in the room plummeted. The last candle flickered, then died, plunging them into darkness. Somewhere in the blackness, a small, cold hand brushed against Arthur's wrist. He screamed. The door burst open, revealing Drusus, holding an oil lamp and looking mildly exasperated. Really? Already? Reginald, still buried under blankets, pointed a shaking finger toward the hearth. In there are ghost children in here. Drusus sighed. Yes, they're part of the package. Think of them as a historical ambiance. B glared. I don't remember Wechtag in the invitation. Drusus shrugged. Fine. If you're going to be sensitive about it, I'll ask them to tone it down. He turned toward the empty hearth and said, in the tone of a man negotiating with unruly pets, "Boys, not tonight." A petulant silence followed. Then faintly, the sound of small footsteps retreating into stone. Drusus turned back to them. "There, happy?" Arthur, still clutching his wrist, gaped. "You talking to them?" "Of course. They're terrible at charades, but they adore hide and seek." He straightened. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a poker game with Thomas More. He cheats." With that, he closed the door again, leaving the guests in darkness, silence, and the dawning realization that they were very much not alone. Reginald exhaled. "So, who's up for pulling an all-nighter?" The scratching, very softly, began again. Somewhere in the walls a child giggled. Sleep, it seemed, would not be coming easily tonight. Chapter 6. The Midnight Tour. No one had actually managed to sleep. Between the whispering walls, the phantom giggles, and Reginald's increasingly dramatic threats to haunt the living daylights out of Drusus if this doesn't stop, the night had stretched on in a haze of exhaustion and low-grade terror. At precisely midnight, though how anyone could tell without clocks was a mystery, the door creaked open without warning, revealing Drusus silhouetted against the gloom of the corridor. His coat seemed to absorb what little light existed, making him look less like a man and more like a particularly stylish hole in reality. "Rise and shine, sleepyheads," he said, his voice dripping with false cheer. "Time for the midnight tour." Reginald sat up, his hair sticking out at improbable angles. "Are you joking? It's the middle of the night." Drusus tilted his head. "Is it? How strange. I could have sworn time worked differently here." He clapped his hands together. "Up, up! The ghosts are terribly punctual, and they do hate waiting." Grumbling, the group extracted themselves from their beds. Bee had never fully unzipped her sleeping bag, a decision she now considered prescient. Arthur, ever the academic, had spent the last hour scribbling notes by flashlight, documenting every odd sound as if compiling evidence for a paranormal court case. "Where exactly are we touring at this hour?" Bee asked, rubbing her eyes. Drusus smiled. "Places the day trippers never see. The interesting bits." The corridor outside their chamber was colder than before, the stones exhaling a damp, earthy chill that seeped into bones. Drusus led the way, his oil lamp casting just enough light to reveal the edges of things. A suit of armor here, a rusted iron bracket there, while leaving the rest to the imagination. Their first stop was a narrow staircase, its steps worn uneven by centuries of footsteps. "Ah, the Salt Tower," Drusus announced, as if this explained anything. "Lovely spot. Terrible acoustics." Arthur frowned. "What happened here?" "Torture, mostly. Also some very awkward family reunions." Drusus ran a hand along the wall, his fingers brushing a series of faint scratches in the stone. "Prisoners used to carve messages into the walls. This one's my favorite." He held the lamp closer, revealing a crude etching of a stick figure holding what might have been a sword, or possibly a very determined spoon. Reginald squinted. "Is that a knight?" "Close. It's the Duke of Northumberland's attempt at art therapy." Bee leaned in. "What does it say underneath?" Drusus cleared his throat. "Keith found guilty. Please forward my remains to France. The food is better." Arthur scribbled in his notebook. "Fascinating." The next stop was a small, windowless chamber that smelled faintly of rust and rosemary. Drusus gestured grandly. "The Wakefield Tower, where Henry VI met his unfortunate ending." Reginald edged backward. "Met his wife now?" "Allegedly," Drusus amended, though his tone suggested he was anything but impartial. "The official story is that he died of melancholy. The unofficial story involves a pike, several angry nobles, and a prayer book that may or may not have been used as a blunt object." Bee crossed her arms. "You say that like you were there." Drusus' smile didn't waver. I say a lot of things. A draft snaked through the room, extinguishing the lamp for a heartbeat before it flickered back to life. In that moment of darkness, something brushed against Reginald's arm. Something cold and unmistakably eye-fingery. He yelped. Drusus sighed. Oh, don't mind him. That's just Edmund. He's clingy. Arthur, who had been inspecting a dark stain on the floor, looked up sharply. Him? The late Earl of Warwick. Lovely fellow. Terrible personal space boundaries. The tour continued, each stop more unsettling than the last. The Chapel Royal, where headless whispers sometimes joined the hymns. The Queen's house, where Anne Boleyn's ghost allegedly held phantom tea parties. Drusus claimed she loathed chamomile. The Beauchamp Tower, where a particularly verbose prisoner had carved an entire sonnet into the wall, only for Drusus to casually mention the man had been executed before finishing the last stanza. The line between performance and reality grew thinner with each step. The cold drafts came too regularly to be coincidence. The distant whispers, sometimes laughter, sometimes weeping, seemed to track their movements, always just out of earshot. Then came the Green Tower. Even Drusus' usual sardonic demeanor faltered slightly as they approached. Now this one's special, he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. The room was small, circular, and dominated by a single wooden block set atop a raised platform. The air smelled of old wood and something metallic that no amount of time could erase. B went very still. Is that the execution block? Yes. Drusus ran a hand over the surface, his fingers pausing over a deep groove in the wood. This is where they knelt, where they waited in, and where, eventually, he mimed a swift, downward motion. Reginald took a deliberate step back. Can we not linger here? But Arthur, despite his pallor, stepped closer. Who died here? Drusus' expression darkened. Who I didn't see. A gust of wind howled through the room, though there were no windows. The lamp guttered wildly, sending shadows leaping across the walls, shadows that for a moment seemed to take the shape of hooded figures, of raised axes, of kneeling forms. Then, silence. Drusus exhaled. Right, moving on. The final stop was the Tower Green itself, the open space where so many had met their end. The moon hung heavy overhead, casting the cobblestones in silver and black. Drusus spread his arms. And here we are, the main event. Me shivered. It's smaller than I imagined. History often is. A breeze stirred the grass at the edges of the green. For a moment, the air itself seemed to vibrate with something unspoken, some memory too old to fade. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, a voice whispered, "Off with his head." The words were playful, almost sing-song, but the effect was instant. The temperature dropped. The lamp flame turned blue, and the shadows at the edges of the green seemed to glisten inward, as if straining to hear more. Reginald grabbed Drusus' arm. Okay, what was that? Drusus didn't pull away. That, he said softly, was Margaret Poe. She's enthusiastic about reenactments. Arthur's voice was barely a whisper. Margaret Poe, the Countess of Salisbury, the one who ran circles around the executioner? Yes, she hated it, going quietly. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Then, from the far end of the green, came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. The crunch of gravel under invisible weight. Drusus straightened. Right on time. B tensed. Time for unfair. You what? The footsteps stopped. The air grew heavier. Then, a new voice, clear, regal, and utterly present, spoke from the empty dark. Behold, es disturb my rest. Drusus grinned. Oh, this'll be fun. The lamp went out, and the ear-reeling tour began. Chapter 7. The Diary of a Doomed Prisoner. The walk back to their chamber was a blur of whispers and shadows. Whoever, or whatever, had spoken on the tower green did not follow, but the echo of that regal voice lingered in the air like the aftershock of a thunderclap. By unspoken agreement, no one asked Drusus to explain. Some questions, it seemed, were better left unanswered. Back in the bloody tower, the beds looked no more inviting than before. The velvet hangings still sagged with dust. The pillows still bore their unsettling embroidery, and the scratching in the walls had resumed with renewed enthusiasm. Bee collapsed onto her bed, rubbing her temples. Remind me why we agreed to this again. Reginald, who had spent the return trip glancing over his shoulder every 3 steps, flopped backward onto his mattress. Free food? Historical curiosity? Temporary insanity? Arthur, ever the scholar, had already pulled out his notebook and was scribbling furiously. The psychological impact of haunted spaces is fascinating. A loud thumping from beneath his bed cut him off. Everyone froze. The scratching stopped. Then from under Arthur's pillow came a soft, crinkling sound, like old parchment being disturbed. He yelped and scrambled backward, nearly toppling off the bed. Something's in there. Reginald groaned. Of course there is. Bee, despite her better judgment, leaned over and lifted the pillow. Beneath it lay a small leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age, and its pages yellowed at the edges. A frayed ribbon marked a spot somewhere in the middle, as if the last reader had left in a hurry. Arthur inched closer. Is that a diary? Bee picked it up gingerly, half expecting it to disintegrate in her hands. The leather was cool and slightly damp, like stone left in fog. She flipped it open to the first page, where a faded inscription read, Property of E. Whitby, 1554. If found, please return to the tower. I shan't be leaving. Mrs. Reginald peered over her shoulder. Cheery. Bee turned the page. The handwriting was cramped, the ink blotched in places where the writer's hand had evidently shaken. The first entry was dated October 12th, 1554. Kai brought me to the tower on charges of treason, though what treason I've committed remains a mystery. The guards say I look suspicious, which, given the state of my hair after 3 days in a cell, I cannot dispute. They've given me this journal to record my thoughts. I suspect they mean to use it against me later. Arthur's eyes widened. This is incredible. A first-hand account of Tudor imprisonment. B. Turn another page. The next entry was shorter. October 14th. The rats are excellent conversationalists, though their politics are simplistic. The guard who brings my meals has a face like a half-chewed apple and a temperament to match. He tells me the Queen is displeased. I tell him the feeling is mutual. Reginald snorted. This guy's got spirit. The entries continued, each one a little more desperate, a little more resigned. By October 20th, E. Whitby had begun counting the stones in his cell to pass the time. By the 25th, he was speculating about which of his so-called friends had betrayed him. Then B. reached the marked page. October 30th, The handwriting here was different, shakier, as if written in haste or under duress. Kava told me I'm to die at dawn. No trial, no last words worth recording. Just a blade and a crowd and the great yawning silence afterward. Strange to think this will be my last entry. Stranger still to think that whoever reads this may one day lie where I lie, write what I write, and wonder as I do if the past is ever truly. The words sent a chill down Bee's spine. She turned the page and froze. The next entry was dated October 31st. But that wasn't possible. E. Whitby had been scheduled to die on the 30th. Her hands trembled as she read. They came for me at midnight, not the guards, the others, the ones who walk the tower when the living are asleep. They offered me a choice, die now and be forgotten, or stay and become part of the story. I chose the latter. If you're reading this, so did you. B's breath caught. The handwriting, it had changed. The earlier entries had been cramped, uneven. But this looked familiar. Too familiar. She flipped to the last page. There, in fresh ink, was a new entry. Dated, Clonite, Gaunty, Una. Kyre watching. They've always been watching. The tower doesn't just hold ghosts, it makes them. Ask Drusus what happened to the last group of guests, if you dare. And the handwriting. B dropped the diary as if it had burned her. It was Cantas. Every loop, every slant, every idiosyncratic flourish, it was horror writing. Reginald picked it up, frowning. What's wrong? Then he saw it. His face went pale. Arthur, oblivious, took the diary next. Fascinating. The ink on the last entry appears fresh, which suggests some kind of temporal. He stopped, blinked, looked up at B. This is your handwriting. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. From somewhere deep in the tower, a clock struck a hollow midnight chime. The scratching in the wall stopped. The door creaked open, and Drusus stood on the threshold, his coat swirling like smoke, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. Find anything interesting? B's voice was barely a whisper. What is in this? Drusus stepped inside, his boots silent on the stones. A diary, obviously. Who wrote the last entry? His smile widened. Who do you think? The air grew colder. The shadows at the edges of the room deepened, pooling like ink. Reginald backed toward the window. Okay, new plan. We leave. Now. Drusus skicked. But you haven't finished the story. Arthur, ever the academic, clutched the diary like a lifeline. Is this some kind of psychological experiment? A trick? No trick, Drusus said softly. Just history, repeating itself. A gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him. The diary in Arthur's hands rippled, the pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. And then, before their eyes, new words began to form. Letters rising from the paper like ink bleeding through from some unseen hand. B grabbed Arthur's arm. What's it saying? His voice shook as he read aloud. Kyre coming. They're here. They've always been here. The tower doesn't just hold ghosts, it makes them. And you're next. The words glistened wetly as if freshly written. As if written, Vinovi, Gotvai. Drusus sighed. Right on schedule. And then the lights went out. Chapter 8. A Game of Traitors. The darkness lasted only a moment, but when the candlelight sputtered back to life, the chamber was no longer empty. Dozens of figures crowded the room, translucent, flickering, dressed in fashions spanning centuries. A woman in a stained Tudor gown clutched a goblet of spectral wine. A round-head soldier leaned against the wall, his helmet tucked under one arm. Near the window, a man in 18th century finery adjusted a cravat that no longer existed. And at the center of it all, Drusus stood with a deck of yellowed playing cards in his hand, smiling like a man about to reveal a particularly clever trick. Lovely of you all to join us, he said. Shall we play a game? Reginald, who had been halfway out the window, froze. What kind of game? Drusus shuffled the cards with practiced ease. A simple one, really. Accusations, denials, a bit of light treason, the usual. Arthur, still clutching the diary, swallowed hard. This is about the entries, isn't it? Everything is about the entries, Drusus said lightly. But tonight, it's also about history. He fanned the cards out with a flick of his wrist. Each of you will draw. The card will name your crime. You will plead your case. And then, his smile sharpened. Well, let's just say punishments here are very traditional. We crossed our arms. And if we refuse? One of the ghosts, a gaunt man in a judge's wig, let out a dry chuckle. Then we vote on your guilt anyway. Drusus nodded. Democracy in action. The candlelight guttered, casting restless shadows across the walls. The ghosts watched with hungry interest, their hollow eyes gleaming. Reginald muttered, "I hatikames." But there was no refusing. Not with the way the air had thickened, not with the way the walls seemed to press closer, not with the way the diary's last words still burned in B's mind. Führe next. Istilmenti, Bison Filsandiator. Arthur drew first. His hands trembled as he pulled a card from the deck. "Ah," Drusus said, plucking it from his fingers. "Plotting to overthrow the crown via illicit pamphleteering? A classic. How do you plead?" Arthur adjusted his spectacles. "That is, I've never even yawned a pamphlet." Drusus turned to the assembled ghosts. "Juros." The spectral figures murmured amongst themselves. Then the judge raised a bony hand. "Guilty." A chorus of agreement rose from the others. Drusus sighed. "I'm afraid the verdict is in. For your crimes against the realm you are sentenced to the press." Arthur blinked. "The what?" Two burly ghosts in tunics stepped forward, carrying what looked like a wooden board and a stack of large, flat stones. "Oh no," B whispered. Reginald paled. "Is that bene forte iture drusus confirmed?" The medieval method of persuasion. "You'll be pressed beneath weights until you confess, or until you lie flatten." Arthur's voice cracked. "This is barbaric." Drusus shrugged. "It's Gisterindort." The ghosts advanced. Arthur yelped and scrambled backward, but the chamber had grown smaller somehow, the walls nudging him toward the makeshift torture device. At the last moment, B stepped forward. "Wait, what if we appeal?" Drusus arched a brow. "On what grounds?" "Wrong century," she blurted. "Pamphleteering wasn't a capital offense until the 17th century. This is El Tudor law." A murmur ran through the ghosts. Judge stroked his spectral chin. Drusus' smile was approving. "A fair point. Very well. Arthur is grip-reviewed." He snapped his fingers, and the pressing ghosts vanished. Next, Reginald drew with the enthusiasm of a man selecting his own noose. His card read, "It conspiring with Spanish spies to poison the Queen's favorite pudding." "How specific," he muttered. Drusus tutted. "Pudding treason is no laughing matter. How do you plead?" Reginald crossed his arms. "Not guilty. I don't even like pudding." The ghosts conferred. The judge leaned forward. "Guilty." Reginald threw up his hands. "Rigged. This is a rigged system." Drusus ignored him. "For your crimes, you are sentenced to hanging, drawing, and quartering." A noose dropped from the ceiling. Reginald yelped, "Oh, come." But the ghosts were already reaching for him, their cold fingers brushing his arms. Then B stepped forward again. "Objection." Drusus sighed. "Again?" "Hanging, drawing, and quartering wasn't used for pudding crimes," she insisted. "That was for high treason against the estate, not the royal dessert tray." The judge frowned. "She's not wrong." Drusus rolled his eyes. "Fine, Reginald, you are reproved." The noose vanished, but only because legal technicalities amuse me. Now it was B's turn. Her card, when she drew it, bore a single word. "Witchcraft." Es non-vanishing, bis der halbe de Bobisha. Drusus' grin was positively gleeful. Oh, how delicious! How do you plead? B met his gaze. Innocent, obviously. The ghosts whispered. The judge steepled his fingers. Guilty. Drusus spread his hands. For your crimes you are sentenced to drowning. A tub of water appeared in the center of the room, its surface shimmering unnaturally. B's stomach lurched. That's not how witch trials worked. They tested witches by throwing them in water. If you floated, you were guilty if you sank. You drowned, Drusus finished. Yes, poetic, isn't it? Two ghostly matrons in Puritan garb seized her arms, their grip like icy manacles. Arthur and Reginald moved to help, but the other ghosts closed ranks, blocking their path. B struggled as the matrons dragged her toward the tub. This isn't a Gigime anymore. Drusus' voice was suddenly very close to her ear. Oh, but it is, and you're losing. The water loomed before her, dark and impossibly deep. Then... Stop, Dawkins. The voice was quiet, but firm. Everyone turned. Sir Roland, who had been watching silently from the corner, floated forward. Enough. Drusus arched a brow. Interfering, Roland? The ghost's form flickered, as if gathering strength. This isn't justice. It's Wuthiara. A murmur ran through the spectral crowd. Drusus' smile didn't waver, but something in his eyes hardened. All justice is theater. The tower has always been a stage. Sir Roland shook his head. Not like this. For a long moment, no one moved. The candlelight guttered. The air grew thick with something unspoken. Then Drusus sighed. Very well, the game is Ensha paused. With a snap of his fingers, the tub vanished. The matrons released B. The cards fluttered to the floor, blank once more. The ghosts grumbled but began to disperse, some fading through walls, others simply blinking out like snuffed candles. Within moments the chamber was empty again, save for Drusus, Sir Roland, and three very shaken mortals. Drusus smoothed his coat. You're lucky Roland has a soft spot for the living. His smile was thin. I'd sleep lightly tonight, if I were you. And with that, he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Reginald exhaled. Okay, new plan. We burn the diary. Arthur clutched it tighter. We can't. It's a historical artifact. B rubbed her arms, still feeling the ghostly grip of the matrons. It's more than that. It's a warning. Sir Roland drifted closer. He's right, you know, about the tower being a stage. His voice was barely a whisper. And every play needs its players. B met his hollow gaze. What happens if we stay? The ghost's form flickered. You've read the diary, you know. Arthur's breath hitched. We become part of the story. Sir Roland didn't answer. He didn't need to. Outside, the first light of dawn crept through the window, but no one dared to sleep. Chapter 9. The Vanishing Host. Dawn bled through the narrow window of the bloody tower, casting thin, hesitant light across the chamber. No one had slept. The diary lay on the table between them, its pages slightly parted as if sighing in its sleep. Reginald rubbed his eyes, his voice rough with exhaustion. So, we're agreed? The diary is cursed, the ghosts are way too invested in legal technicalities, and Drusus is a problem, B finished. Arthur, who had spent the last hour poring over the diary's earlier entries, adjusted his spectacles. There's something we're missing. The last guest who wrote in this Whitby, he mentions a choice. Die and be forgotten, or stay and become part of the story. He looked up. What if Drusus was one of them? The words hung in the air. B stood abruptly. We need to find him. The tower in daylight was different, not safer exactly, but at least the shadows had retreated to their usual corners. The corridors were empty, the echoes of their footsteps bouncing off stones that had seen too much to care about three sleep-deprived mortals. They checked the banquet hall first. The long tables were bare now, no trace of the bizarre historical dishes from the night before. The coronation chair replica sat empty, its wooden surface smooth and unmarked. No Drusus. They tried the salt tower next. The scratched prisoner's graffiti remained, but the air was still and stale, like a museum exhibit frozen in time. Reginald nudged a rusted iron bracket with his foot. Maybe he got bored, packed up his ghost friends and left. Arthur frowned. He doesn't seem like the type. Then Bee spotted it. A slip of paper tucked into a crack in the wall, barely visible unless you were looking for it. She pulled it free, her fingers brushing cold stone. The note was written in that same too familiar handwriting, the one that matched the diary's last entries, the one that had sent chills down her spine. Gonna to settle an old debt. If I don't return, ask the Duke of Northumberland about the duck. He'll deny it, but he knows. Bee read it aloud. Reginald blinked. The Yai Ducky. Arthur's eyes lit up. The Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, executed in 1553 for supporting Lady Jane Grey's claim to the throne. But what duck? A sound cut him off, a sharp, rhythmic tap-tap-tapping from above. They looked up. One of the tower's ravens perched on a high windowsill, its beak tapping against the glass. Not Merlin, the large, imperious one from before, but a smaller bird with a crooked wing. It cocked its head, staring down at them with unsettling intelligence. Then it spoke. Not a call. You were doing. And Ramsay, Nil Silvarande. Reginald took a step back. Okay, no, birds shouldn't din talking. Arthur, however, was already moving toward the staircase. It's leading us somewhere. Bee hesitated only a moment before following. The raven hopped along the sill, keeping pace with them as they ascended the narrow spiral stairs. The higher they climbed, the colder the air grew. By the time they reached the topmost chamber, a small circular room with a single wooden chair and a portrait of a scowling nobleman, their breath misted in front of them. The raven fluttered down to perch on the chair's back. Eerie. Arthur approached the portrait. This must be the Duke. The painting showed a man in his 50s, his expression caught somewhere between arrogance and exhaustion. His fingers clutched the hilt of a sword, and at his feet, barely visible in the corner of the canvas, was a small white duck. Bee leaned closer. That's odd. Why would a Tudor nobleman have a duck in his portrait? The raven chuckled, a sound no bird should have been able to make. Then the Duke's eyes moved. Reginald yelped. Nope, absolutely not. The painted figure's lips curled into a sneer. Oh, enough you lot show up. Typical. Arthur gasped. You're alive. Dead, the Duke corrected. But flattered. His painted gaze flicked to the note in Bee's hand. Let me guess, Drusus left you that. Bee nodded. He mentioned you, and a duck. The Duke groaned. That beauty. After all these centuries, he's still hung up on that. The raven pecked at the portrait's frame. Tell them. The Duke sighed, his brushstrokes rippling. Fine. But it's a stupid story. He gestured to the duck at his feet. 1537. Drusus, though he went by a different name then, was a guardsman here. I was a prisoner awaiting execution. One night he smuggled in a duck. Don't ask me why. Maybe he thought it would cheer me up. Maybe he was drunk. Either way, the thing got loose, waddled straight into the king's chambers, and bit Henry Vade on the... The raven coughed. The Duke amended. A sensitive area. Reginald snorted. That's why Drusus is here. Because of a duck incident? The portrait's expression soured. He took the blame, said it was his fault, not mine. They executed him the next morning. The Duke's painted fingers tightened on his sword. But the tower doesn't let go of things, or people, that easily. Arthur's eyes widened. He became part of the story. Exactly. The Duke's gaze grew distant. Now he's stuck here, playing host to every fool who accepts that damned invitation. And every so often, he gets nostalgic. Bee's stomach twisted. Where is he now? The raven flapped its wings. Gone it, to settle the debt. The Duke groaned again. Oh, he's gone to apologize to Henry VIII, hasn't he? The raven nodded. Arthur paled. But Henry VIII's ghost is terrifying, unhinged, still angry about the duck? The Duke rolled his eyes. Yes. A cold wind howled through the chamber, though there were no open windows. The candle on the desk guttered wildly. The Duke's painted face grew serious. If you want to save your friend, you'd better hurry. Henry's not known for forgiveness. Bee turned toward the door. Where would they be? The raven hopped down to the floor. Wakefir Tower, where kings die. The Duke added, and try not to get executed on the way. It's very inconvenient. But they were already running. Chapter 10. The Locked Door Mystery. The path to the Wakefield Tower twisted through corridors that hadn't been on any of the official tours. The stones here were rougher, the air thick with the scent of damp wool, and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. The raven led the way, its crooked wing beating unevenly as it hopped from shadow to shadow. They reached the tower's base, only to find the door. The same one Drusus had opened for them the night before, firmly shut. A heavy iron padlock hung from the latch, its keyhole rusted with age and streaked with something dark that flaked away when Bee touched it. Reginald rattled the handle. It was Bustick open. Who locked it? Arthur crouched to examine the lock. This hasn't been touched in decades. Look at the oxidation. Bee ran a hand along the doorframe. Then, how did Drusus get in? The raven, perched on a nearby sconce, let out a low croak. Another way. Reginald groaned. Of course there's another way, because why wouldn't there be a secret murder passage in a place like this? The bird tilted its head. Not murder. Escape. Arthur's eyes lit up. Of course, prisoners would have had hidden routes, ways to move them discreetly. He pressed his palms against the stones beside the door, feeling for irregularities. Help me look for loose bricks. Bee joined him, her fingers tracing the mortar between stones. The cold seeped into her skin, carrying whispers of old voices, words just beyond hearing. Then her thumb caught on something. A stone slightly recessed, its edges worn smooth by time. She pushed. With a grinding groan, a section of the wall slid back, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into blackness. The air that wafted up was frigid and carried the unmistakable tang of old blood. Reginald peered into the dark. I vote we don't go down the creepy murder stairs. The raven fluttered past him, vanishing into the gloom. Arthur adjusted his spectacles. It's either this or leave Drusus to Henry VIII's mercy. Bee took a deep breath and stepped onto the first stair. The stone was uneven, worn smooth by centuries of desperate footsteps. The passage twisted like a gut, the walls pressing close enough to scrape shoulders. The only light came from Arthur's pocket flashlight, its beam bouncing off damp stone, and the occasional rusted iron ring set into the walls. Then the stairs ended at another door, this one low and arched, its wood blackened with age. The keyhole here was crusted with the same dark substance as the first. Bee knelt to examine it. This isn't rust. Arthur swallowed hard. No, it's not. Reginald hovered behind them. Okay, new plan. We turn around, Pretend we never saw. The door creaked open on its own. The chamber beyond was small, circular, and dominated by a single wooden chair facing a cold hearth. A figure sat slumped in it, his back to them, his coat pooling around him like spilled ink. Drusus. B rushed forward, then froze. The figure in the chair wasn't moving, wasn't breathing. And as she circled to face him, she realized why. It wasn't Drusus at all. The man in the chair wore Drusus's coat, his boots, even his rings, but his face was all wrong. Young and upshy. His throat slit ear to ear in a grin of red. Arthur made a strangled noise. That's not. The original, finished a voice from the shadows. They turned. The yelling Drusus leaned against the far wall, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Blood, or something like it, dripped from his sleeve, pooling on the stones at his feet. Reginald backed toward the door. What the hell is this? Drusus pushed off the wall. This, he said quietly, is how the story starts. He gestured to the corpse in the chair. Mate Thomas, the first me. B's pulse roared in her ears. You said you were executed over a duck. I was, but the tower doesn't just kill people. Drusus's smile was bitter. It collects salmon. He tapped the corpse's shoulder. Thomas did. I walked out, and now here we are. Arthur's voice shook. You're a ghosting? Worse. Drusus's coat shifted, revealing the edge of a wound that hadn't healed in 500 years. I am the eerie. The raven fluttered down to perch on the dead man's shoulder. Tower keeps what it loves. A gust of wind howled through the chamber, though there were no windows. The corpse's fingers twitched. B grabbed Arthur's arm. We need to go, you know way. Drusus didn't stop them as they fled. His voice followed them up the stairs, echoing off the stones. You can't outrun history. It's already written. The door at the top slammed shut behind them, locking with a click that sounded like a bone snapping. Somewhere, in the darkness below, something laughed. Chapter 11. The Echoes of Scaffold Hill. The three of them ran until their lungs burned, bursting into the courtyard like hunted things. The tower loomed around them, its stones drinking in the pale morning light without reflecting any warmth back. The raven had vanished somewhere in their flight, leaving them alone with the whispers of the wind and the weight of what they'd just seen. Reginald braced his hands on his knees, gasping. Okay, what? Was hell? Was anxiety. Arthur, ever the scholar even in terror, adjusted his spectacles with shaking hands. A cognitive echo, perhaps, a temporal manifestation of ease. B cut him off. A corpse. That was a B corpse wearing Drusus's face. The words hung in the air, too heavy to dismiss. Then the cheering started. At first, it was faint. The distant murmur of a crowd. The kind of noise that might drift over from a festival or a football match. But there was no festival, no match. The courtyard was empty, the gates shut tight against the modern world beyond. Yet the sounds grew clearer by the second. Off with his head, someone shouted, their voice rasping with the giddy cruelty of an audience at a public execution. A swell of laughter followed. B turned toward the sound, her skin prickling. It seemed to come from the direction of Tower Green, the very spot where Drusus had led them the night before, where the ghostly voice had hissed off with his heading in the dark. Reginald's face had gone the color of old parchment. Please tell me you're hearing this too. Arthur swallowed hard. Unfortunately, they crept toward the green, drawn despite themselves. The closer they got, the louder the sounds became. Not just cheers now, but the creak of wood underfoot, the rattle of chains, the wet thump of a blade biting into something soft. But the green was empty. No crowd. No executioner. No blood-stained block. Just grass and cobblestones and the relentless, impossible noise of a spectacle none of them could see. Bee stepped forward, her boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. It's like an echo. Arthur knelt, pressing his palm to the ground. Scaffold Hill. This is where they... A woman's scream cut through the air, high and terrified. Reginald stumbled back. Nope, absolutely not, we're leaving. But as he turned, the scream came again, closer this time. And this time, words tangled in it. She'd I queen, but I would rather die the wife of cold pepper. The voice was raw with centuries-old anguish, but the name sent a jolt through Bee. She'd heard it before, in history lectures, in documentaries. Catherine Howard, Dux. Henrietta's fifth wife. Executed right here, on this spot. Her last words a desperate declaration of love for a man who wasn't her husband. Arthur's breath came fast. That's not an echo, that's a why memory. The air thickened. The light dimmed, as if the sun had suddenly remembered it wasn't supposed to shine on this place. And then... figures. Faint at first, like shadows cast by a candle that wasn't there, but solidifying by the second. Proud in Tudor dress, their faces alight with vicious curiosity. A priest murmuring prayers. And at the center, a young woman in a faded black gown, her dark hair pinned up under a simple cap, her hands bound before her. Catherine Howard. Bee's throat closed. The Queen, the High Coast, knelt before a block that hadn't been there moments before. The executioner stood ready, his axe gleaming. Reginald grabbed Bee's arm. We need to go. But she couldn't move, because Catherine Howard was looking straight at her. The dead Queen's lips moved. Help me. The axe fell. The crowd roared. And then... silence. The green was empty again. The air still. The only sound the ragged breathing of three living people who had just witnessed something impossible. Arthur swayed on his feet. That wasn't supposed to happen. Reginald had backed all the way to the edge of the green, his back pressed to the cold stones of the tower wall. Define wasn't supposed to, because at this point I'm not sure what's supposed to happen here. Bee stared at the spot where the ghostly axe had fallen. The grass there was slightly flattened, as if by an invisible weight. Then the whispering started. Not from the green this time. From the stones themselves. From the air. From inside their own heads. You're next. Can it come? And yost. You die. You're next. The inside. The phobia will be distinctly okay. I knew there. I believe. I know. This. The words overlapped, layered, a chorus of dead voices rising in dreadful harmony. Arthur clamped his hands over his ears. Make it stop. A shadow detached itself from the wall near Reginald, resolving into the shape of a man in a guard's uniform, one they'd seen before. The same guard who had accused E. Whitby of looking suspicious in the diary entries. The ghost grinned, revealing teeth blackened by time. Too late for that. And then the screaming started again. But this time, it wasn't Catherine Howard's voice. It was coming from inside the tower. It was coming from my eerie room. Bee ran first, the others close behind. The corridors twisted and turned, the tower reshaping itself around them, stones groaning as passageways narrowed and doorways appeared where there had been none before. They burst into the bloody tower to find their chamber in shambles, the beds overturned, the diary open on the floor, its pages fluttering as if in a breeze, and on the wall above where Bee's bed had been, scrawled in something dark and wet-looking. "Here come home oin." Arthur made a small broken noise. That's bloody. Reginald backed toward the door. We have to get out of this place. But the door slammed shut before he could reach it. The whispering rose to a crescendo. You're next. In Chiflane Dabe. You're next. You're next. And beneath it all, barely audible, the sound of a duck quacking. Then, darkness. Chapter 12. The Mirror of Past Faces. The darkness didn't lift so much as it widening, like ink diluted in water. Slowly, shapes emerged. The overturned beds, the scattered pages of the diary, the jagged letters on the wall still glistening wetly. And then there was the mirror. It stood against the far wall, where no mirror had been before. A tall, ornate thing in a tarnished silver frame, its surface mottled with age. Bee's breath hitched as she realized it wasn't reflecting the room. Not their room, anyway. The mirror showed a grand hall, its stone walls hung with tapestries, its floor strewn with rushes. Figures in Tudor dress mildaba, men in doublets, women in wide skirts, their faces oddly blurred, as if the mirror couldn't quite decide which moment in time to show. Reginald took a shaky step forward. Okay, new rule. No more sudden haunted furniture. Arthur, ever the academic, edged closer, squinting at the glass. Remarkable. It's like a window into the past, but then he froze. Because the figures in the mirror had frozen, too. And they were turning. Slowly, deliberately, toward the glass. Toward the nyan de Karihi, Desankapani Gili de Paploa, which had she becamae, Kayanea Madeleines. Bee's pulse roared in her ears. Arthur stepped back, but he didn't move. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on one figure in particular. A man in scholar's robes, his face half hidden in shadow. A man with Arthur's own features. The scholar's lips moved, his voice muffled as if speaking through water. You've won at last. Arthur made a small, broken noise. That's me. The scholar extended a hand toward the glass, his fingers pressing against the surface from the other side. The mirror rippled like a pond struck by a stone. Reginald grabbed Arthur's arm and yanked him backward just as the scholar's fingertips breached the glass, stretching into their world, gray and withered, the nails blackened with age. Bee lunged for the diary, flipping frantically through the pages. Whitby mentioned this. He wrote about a mirror that showed. Her voice died, because now was in the glass. Not modern-day Bee in her practical jacket and boots, but a woman in a stained linen dress, her hair braided tightly back, her hands raw with work. A kitchen maid, perhaps, or a prisoner, and the woman was screaming. Soundlessly, horribly, her hands pressed against the glass as if trying to push through. Reginald backed away until he hit the wall. Nope. No, I'm not looking. But the mirror didn't need him to look. The glass shimmered, the scene shifting again, to a dim cell, to a man in chains, to a face Reginald knew far too well. His own. The prisoner looked up, his eyes hollow with despair. Took you long enough, he rasped. Reginald's sneeze gave out. The mirror wasn't showing the past. It was showing Ainthame. Their faces, their forms, scattered across centuries of the tower's history like seeds sown in poisoned soil. Bee's hands shook as she gripped the diary. This is what Drusus meant, about becoming part of the story. Arthur tore his gaze from the glass. Reincarnation? Temporal echoes? Or worse? Bee pointed to the last page of the diary, where fresh ink still glistened. The tower doesn't just hold ghosts, it makes them. The figures in the mirror pressed closer, their hands flattening against the glass, their mouths moving in unison now. Yoin-us, Yoin-us, Anteposin-yons. The words dripped into the room like water leaking from a tomb. Then the glass cracked. A single fracture, jagged as a lightning bolt, splitting the mirror down the middle. The figures on the other side smiled, and the door behind them burst open. Drusus stood on the threshold, his coat in tatters, his face streaked with something dark. He looked like a man who'd been dragged through centuries of bad decisions. "Well," he said, eyeing the mirror. "That's unfortunate." Reginald scrambled to his feet. "Where the hell have you been?" "Apologizing to a dead king." Drusus strode forward, his boots leaving faint bloody prints on the stones. "It went about as well as you'd expect." The mirror shuddered, the cracks spreading. A hand, Arthur's scholar, poked through, skeletal fingers grasping at the air. Drusus sighed. "Right, we're leaving." B didn't argue. None of them did. They ran. Down the stairs, through the corridors, past doors that hadn't been there before, past shadows that reached for them with familiar hands. The tower was waking up, and it remembered their faces. Drusus led them to a narrow servants' passage, then down a set of stairs so tight they had to turn sideways to fit. The air grew colder with every step, the walls pressing in like a vice. Then light. A door. An exit. B didn't dare hope until she felt the night air on her face, until her boots hit the cobblestones of the outer ward, until the tower loomed behind them like a bad dream. Drusus didn't stop until they were at the gates, until the ravens were watching them from the battlements, until the first true light of dawn touched the stones. Then he turned, his face haggard in the growing light. "The tower keeps what it loves," he said quietly. "And it loves repetition." Arthur swayed on his feet. "Those were us." In the mirror. Yes and no. Drusus' smile was thin. "They're what you would have been if you'd lived here. If you died here. The tower loves its patterns." Reginald pointed a shaking finger back at the fortress. "So what, we're just, what?" Prehaunted. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of cheering from Scaffold Hill. Drusus didn't answer. He didn't need to. The gates creaked open on their own. The invitation had said historical revelry. It hadn't mentioned the fine print. B took one last look at the tower, at the ravens watching from the walls, at the shadows pooling in its high windows. Then she stepped through the gates, and didn't look back. Chapter 13. The clock strikes a forgotten hour. The moment the tower gates clanged shut behind them, the world snapped back into focus with jarring clarity. The noise of modern London rushed in. Cars honking, distant sirens, the hum of a city that didn't know or care about ghosts. The air smelled of rain and exhaust. Instead of damp stone, an old blood. Reginald sagged against a nearby lamppost, his breath coming in ragged gulps. "Tell me that's it. Tell me we're done." Drusus studied the tower over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "For now." B checked her phone automatically. No signal, which wasn't surprising given the hour. But it was the time display that made her freeze. The screen read Shire 413, but the second counter wasn't moving. It was stuck, frozen mid-tick. Arthur noticed first. "Your phone stopped." B turned the screen toward him. "Yours?" He pulled out his pocket watch, an affectation none of them had teased him about until now, and frowned. "Stopped at 4:13 as well." Reginald checked his wristwatch, then paled. "Same at Banquet." A chill crawled up B's spine. "That's not possible." As if in answer, the tower clock struck. The sound was wrong, deeper, heavier, as if the bell had been struck with something far denser than metal. The first chime reverberated through the pavement under their feet. The second made the streetlights flicker. By the third chime, they realized the terrible truth. The clock wasn't striking 4. It wasn't striking any number that belonged on a modern clock. Reginald clutched his ears. "What is that?" Drusus didn't flinch. "The 13th hour." The final chime hung in the air like a physical thing, pressing down on them with the weight of centuries. For a heartbeat, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The traffic noises stuttered. The wind died. Even the distant glow of the city dimmed. Then, with a sound like a sigh, time lurched forward again. B's phone screen blinked back to life. 4:14, the seconds ticking normally now. Arthur's pocket watch gave a soft whir as its gears unstuck. Reginald's wristwatch emitted a faint, pathetic beep, like a small animal startled awake. Drusus straightened his coat. "Come along. Dawn's not safe here." Arthur stared at the tower, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. "That's not? Clocks don't have a 13th hour?" "No," Drusus agreed. "But the tower does." B's skin prickled. "What happens during the 13th hour?" A shadow passed over Drusus's face. "Nothing good." He led them away from the tower, down side streets that twisted unexpectedly, past buildings that seemed to lean away from them as if wary. The pre-dawn light painted everything in shades of gray, turning the familiar city into something foreign and faintly menacing. Reginald kept glancing at his watch as if expecting it to stop again. "So what? Time just breaks here near the tower." Drusus snorted. "Time doesn't break, it remembers." He nodded toward a pub sign creaking in the wind, an old-fashioned clock face with 13 numbers. "London's full of little scars. Most people walk right past them." Arthur's fingers twitched toward his notebook before remembering he'd lost it somewhere in the tower. 13th hour lore appears in medieval texts, but I've never seen. You wouldn't have. Drusus rounded a corner, the first true sunlight finally touching his too pale face. The tower's always been its own country, with its own rules. B studied him. The way the light didn't quite land on him right, the way his shadow seemed to lag a half-second behind. "You're stuck in it, aren't you? The 13th hour." For the first time, something like pain flickered across Drusus's face. Everyone's stuck in their own hour, sooner or later. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning none of them wanted to examine too closely. A bus rumbled past, its lit interior showing early morning commuters dozing against the windows. The normalcy of it was almost jarring. Reginald exhaled sharply. "Right, I'm going home. I'm burning these clothes. I'm never answering mysterious invitations again." Drusus's smile was thin. "See that you don't." He turned to go, but B caught his sleeve. "Wait, what about the mirror? What about the other US?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "The tower keeps what it loves," he said softly. "But you got out. That's what matters." And with that he was gone, vanished into the dawn mist like a bad dream dissolving in daylight. The three of them stood there for a long moment, the sounds of the waking city rising around them. Somewhere in the distance a clock struck 5. A normal hour. A safe hour. B took a deep breath. "Come on, let's go home." But as they walked away, none of them dared to look back. And none of them noticed their shadows were still wrong, stretched too long, moving just a heartbeat out of sync. Like something was following them. Like something had always been following them. Chapter 14. The Final Confession. The pub was the kind of place tourists never found. Low ceilings, sticky floors, and a barman who looked like he'd been poured from one of his own taps. It was the perfect place to drink away the memory of haunted towers and impossible clocks. Or it would have been, if the memories hadn't followed them inside. Reginald drained his third pint with practiced efficiency. "Right, new rule. No more historical sites, no more overnight stays, no more adjusts." Arthur swirled his untouched whiskey, watching the way the light caught the amber liquid. "You can't just ban ghosts." "I can, and I have." Reginald waved at the bartender for another round. "They're worse than solicitors." Bee hadn't spoken since they'd sat down. She'd been staring at her hands, her fingers tracing the lines of her palms as if reading some invisible text. Arthur noticed first. "Bee, you've gone quiet." She looked up, and the expression in her eyes made Reginald's next joke die on his lips. "I remember," she said softly. The pub noise faded, as if the universe itself was leaning in to listen. Arthur set his glass down carefully. "Remember what?" Bee's fingers tightened around her own drink. "The tower. Not from books, not from tours, from PB4. Reginald shifted uncomfortably. "Okay, none of that cryptic. I was the executioner." The words landed like a headsman's axe. Arthur went very still. "That's not possible, isn't it?" Bee's voice was distant, as if speaking from somewhere far away. The weight of the axe, the sound it made when it bit into the block, the way the crowd sighed afterward, like they'd been holding their breath. Her fingers twitched. "I remember the first time I botched it. The prisoner didn't die clean. The screaming." Reginald pushed his drink away. "Okay, that's enough." But Bee wasn't listening. Anne Boleyn begged for a swordsman. Did you know that? French style, quicker, cleaner. But Henry wanted the axe, wanted her to ignore. A humorless smile touched her lips. She still tried to run, at the last moment, her little hands fluttering like birds. I had to chase her. Arthur's whiskey glass had developed a fine crack from the pressure of his grip. History doesn't record who executed Anne. Bee met his gaze. "No, but we do." The air grew thick. The pub's lights flickered, though no one else seemed to notice. Reginald swallowed hard. "This isn't funny." "I'm not joking." Bee's hands were steady now, her voice eerily calm. "I remember the smell of the straw they spread to soak up the blood, the way the leather of the mask stuck to my face in summer, the exact angle to hold the axe for a clean stroke." She looked down at her palms. "I remember all of them, every last one." Arthur's voice was barely a whisper. "How many?" "Enough to know the tower never let me go." Bee's eyes were dark pools in the dim light. "It just waited for me to come back." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the pub's usual background clamor had faded, as if the world had been muted. Then a chair scraped back. Druso stood at that table, his coat dripping rainwater that hadn't fallen tonight, his face pale under the pub's sickly lighting. "Took you long enough to remember," he said to Bee. Reginald nearly overturned his chair in his haste to stand. "Oh, come on." Arthur grabbed his arm. "Wait, do it, quiet." Bee didn't seem surprised to see Drusus. "How long have you known?" "Since you arrived." Drusus slid into the empty seat, his movements too fluid to be entirely human. "The tower recognizes its own." Bee's laugh was hollow. "And here, I thought I was just good at history." Drusus leaned forward. "The question is, what do you do now that you know?" The pub's lights flickered again, and for a heartbeat, Bee's face changed, older, harder, the eyes shadowed by a hood that wasn't there. Reginald made a small, strangled noise. Arthur's grip on his glass tightened until his knuckles cracked. "This isn't possible, isn't it?" Drusus' smile was all teeth. "The tower keeps what it loves, and it loves its executioners." Bee stared at her hands. The hands that had, in another life, ended so many others. "What do you want from me?" Drusus' voice dropped to a whisper. "The same thing the tower has always wanted, for the story to continue." Outside, distant but unmistakable, the tower clock began to chime. But this time it wasn't striking the 13th hour. It was striking one. Dingle towards the Isigdadantes, finger. Final, Dotiessen. Bee stood, her chair scraping against the floor. When she spoke, her voice wasn't entirely her own. I need to go back. Reginald grabbed her arm. Like hell you do. She shook him off with surprising strength. You don't understand. It's Yuge calling. Arthur rose slowly. B, listen to yourself. But she was already moving toward the door, her steps measured, deliberate, the steps of a woman walking to the scaffold. Drusus followed, his shadow stretching long and black across the floor. Reginald looked at Arthur, his face pale. We can't let her go back there. Arthur's expression was grim. I don't think we have a choice. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, and somewhere in the distance, an axe bit deep into wood. The story, as always, continued. Chapter 15. The morning after. Or is it? The first thing Reginald noticed was the smell, no longer the stale beer and fried food of the pub, but the thick, musty scent of old wool and wood smoke. The second thing he noticed was the itching. He opened his eyes to find himself wearing a scratchy linen shirt and woolen hose that clung uncomfortably to his legs. The bed beneath him was no longer the familiar lumpy mattress of the bloody tower, but a straw-stuffed pallet on a stone floor. Arthur sat up beside him, his spectacles miraculously still perched on his nose, though his modern clothes had been replaced by a scholar's robe that looked like it had been chewed by moths. This is not ideal. B stood by the narrow window, her silhouette framed in a dress that hadn't been fashionable since the Tudor era. She turned slowly, and the look on her face sent a chill through Reginald. She wasn't surprised. We're not in our time, she said quietly. Reginald scrambled to his feet, tripping over the unfamiliar clothing. What do you mean, not our time? B pointed out the window. Reginald lunged for it, expecting to see the familiar skyline of modern London. Instead, the view showed a muddy Thames crowded with wooden ships, the skyline dominated by the old London Bridge with its houses stacked like precarious teeth. No skyscrapers. No glass. No anything that belonged to the 21st century. Arthur made a small, strangled noise. This is impossible. B's fingers brushed the rough fabric of her skirts. Is it? The door creaked open before Reginald could respond. Drusus stood in the doorway, looking exactly as he always had, the same too-pale face, the same coat that seemed to drink the light. The only difference was the smile. It was wider now. Hungrier, bundes verwandelnstapabed, hungrier bat hunde from to be safe. Sleep well? He asked, as if they'd simply overslept after a particularly good party. Reginald lunged for him. What the hell did you do? Drusus sidestepped with unnatural ease. May, nothing. You walk back of your own accord. Well? He glanced at B. Most of you did. Arthur adjusted his spectacles with trembling hands. This is some kind of hallucination. Temporal displacement, shared psychosis. Oh, Drusus interrupted. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. He stepped aside, gesturing to the corridor beyond. Shall we? B moved first, her period clothing seeming to fit her too well, as if she'd worn it all her life. Reginald and Arthur exchanged one last desperate look before following. The tower was different now, alive in a way it hadn't been before. Servants bustled through the corridors. Guards in outdated armor stood at attention. The air smelled of roasting meat and human sweat instead of dust and despair. And the people looked at them with recognition. Passing maid curtsied to B. Morning, Mistress Holloway. A guard nodded to Reginald. Sir Fitch. A scholar bowed to Arthur. Reginald grabbed Drusus' arm. What is this? Drusus' smile never wavered. The story, of course. The one you stepped into the moment you accepted that invitation. He leaned in, his breath cold against Reginald's ear. The tower doesn't just remember its ghosts, it repeats them. B turned slowly in place, taking in the bustling courtyard, the living, breathing tower around them. "We're not visitors anymore, are we?" Drusus spread his hands. "Now you're part of the cast." Arthur made a small broken noise. "How do we get back?" For the first time, Drusus's smile faltered. "Who says you can?" The clock began to chime then. A deep, sonorous sound that vibrated through the stones beneath their feet. Not the 13th hour. Not even a modern timekeeping. Just the steady, inevitable march of history repeating itself. Bee turned toward the sound, her face unreadable. "What happens now?" Drusus adjusted his cuffs. "Now? Now you live, until you don't." His smile returned, sharp as an axe blade. "Welcome to the tower." Somewhere in the distance, a raven cawed. And the story began again.